Mr. Speaker, as I rise to make this presentation in the 2020-2021 budget debate, I give thanks to Almighty God for this beautiful gift of life, for health and strength, and for the opportunity to serve the people of Jamaica, land we love. There are also many people who play a critical role in my life and who I need to thank, as gratitude is a must. I begin with my beautiful and loving wife, Sandra, who is a wind beneath my wings and whose calm strength is a rock on which I can always rely. I thank my 3 children who always have my back and have accepted the sacrifice that having a father in the public domain inevitably entails. I thank our party leader and leader of the opposition, Dr. Peter Phillips, for his continuing confidence in me and for his tremendous guidance rooted in unmatched experience over a career of performance and achievement in public life. I thank my South St. Andrew constituency executive for their dedication to our political movement and their unwavering commitment, which ensure that we take nothing for granted and we keep an effective organization on the ground.
May I advise
Mr. Speaker,
members in the gallery not to participate in the proceedings of the House.
Yes.
You have been advised when you are coming. Do not disrupt or disturb the speaker.
Mr.
Thank you very
Speaker,
much.
I also want to say a special word of welcome and thanks to the students from Charlie Smith High School who are here today. I hope you enjoy today's proceedings. And I know some of you are accounting students and so on. I hope you find the presentation interesting. And most of all, Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the people of the great constituency of South St. Andrew for their love and support. You provide the inspiration for the dedication to ongoing service. I thank you for putting me here and for the honor of being your political representative in this honorable House. Let us continue to work together to improve the standard of living in our communities. Mr. Speaker, the budget affects the life of every Jamaican. It decides the extent to which government will protect their lives from danger, keep them healthy, educate their children, and create opportunities to achieve their hopes and dreams. On Tuesday, the Minister announced a reduction of the primary surplus target to 5.4% of GDP for the coming year and over the medium term. This has moved me to say something about the budget process we are now going through. Mr. Speaker, the primary surplus target is the anchor of the entire economic reform program. The fiscal rules, which we have enshrined in law, use the primary surplus target as a mechanism for Jamaica to reduce our debt to 60% of GDP, an international benchmark of debt sustainability for developing countries, by the year 2025-2026. The Minister's fiscal policy paper and the estimates of expenditure tabled on the 11th of February were all built on a primary surplus target of 6.5% of GDP for the next 4 fiscal years. It is those budget documents that were reviewed and approved in the Standing Finance Committee of this House. There is no mention whatsoever of a new primary surplus target of 5.4% in those budget documents. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, even the revised pages of the fiscal policy paper, which were tabled just last week in Standing Finance Committee, expressly maintain the primary surplus target of 6.5% over the coming 4 years. Mr. Speaker, the Auditor General is required by law to review the fiscal policy paper and report on whether it complies with the fiscal rules. She has done so on the basis of a primary surplus of 6.5%, not a lower target of 5.4%. Mr. Speaker, for the Minister to come to this House and announce a significantly lower primary surplus target this week on Tuesday, which is actually, in percentage terms, 16.9% below the 6.5% primary surplus target in the budget documents on which the Auditor General has opined and certified, is not, in my view, in keeping with the spirit and intent of the procedures embodied in the fiscal responsibility framework. It is that fiscal responsibility framework which has taken Jamaica this far along the road to fiscal health, and we should not treat this matter lightly. I am concerned with this approach to pulling up the anchor of the primary surplus target. The budget documents should have been prepared on the basis of the actual primary surplus target which the government will be pursuing, so that the Auditor General could have certified whether or not it complies with the fiscal rules and is a prudent basis for moving forward. This has not happened, Mr. Speaker, and in my view, it has compromised the budget process that we are now engaged in. It is not in keeping with the standard of fiscal governance that we have been adhering to since 2013. Mr. Speaker, when the government passes the appropriation bill on this budget at the end of the budget debate, Jamaicans will not be able to put pot on fire with the comfort of knowing that the Auditor General has confirmed that this lower primary surplus target is consistent with the fiscal rules enshrined in law. Mr. Speaker, I think the procedure has been unfortunate.
Remember, you don't understand it, so you must keep that.
Mr. Speaker, this afternoon, I want to focus the attention of the members of this House and the nation on this government's stewardship of the Jamaican economy. I am forced to return to the issue of economic growth, an issue which I spoke about at length last year. Jamaica needs a strong and growing economy that can support expenditures and investments that will deliver real progress to our people, in line with the Vision 2030 mission of a Jamaica which becomes the place of choice to live, work, raise families, and do business. I will assess the government's performance in this light. When this government came to office, in March 2016, the burden of structural reforms had already been largely accomplished by our work. The macroeconomic situation had been miraculously turned around through great national sacrifice. Jamaica was poised for a new era of high levels of economic growth. This would transform the country and drive the achievement of our Vision 2030 goals. We had done the planting, and the new government came to office on a promise to reap prosperity. The entire country expected that this promise of prosperity would have been kept. And who could blame them for expecting this? After all, the government had inherited from the PNP a stable and improving macroeconomic situation. The fiscal accounts were steadily improving. The primary surplus target had been met over several successive years. The public debt was rapidly declining. Jamaica's net international reserves were steadily growing. Unemployment and poverty were both falling. And yes, the Jamaican stock market had started booming and was ranked the best performer in the world for 2015. We did those things, Mr. Speaker. And I must say, Sister P, take a bow. Dr. Peter Phillips, take a bow. It was not easy. I know this because I was in that cabinet. I was in that cabinet, tasked with ensuring that the legislation to meet the IMF structural benchmarks was delivered on time. Together, our team turned this country around and put Jamaica on a sure path forward. Indeed, Mr. Mr. Speaker, so well was the wicket laid that in 2016, the JLP government's newly minted Economic Growth Council committed to achieving, within 4 years from 2016, real GDP growth of 5% per annum, the famous 5 in 4. The Minister of Finance was the Executive Director of the Economic Growth Council when that aspirational target was set. Mr. Speaker, regrettably, 5 in 4 has not come to pass. In fact, it has turned out to be mere hype. Jamaica has failed to achieve the strong growth we were all expecting. And with it, prosperity remains an illusion for most Jamaicans. Mr. Speaker, that was the Prime Minister's Economic Growth Council. But the official growth projections of successive finance ministers have resulted in one disappointment after another. The September 2016 interim fiscal policy paper projected real GDP growth. This is the 2016 September interim fiscal policy paper. Projected real GDP growth of 2.2% in 2017-18, 3.3% for 2018-19, and 3.2% for 2019-20. In reality, this government has missed every single one of those growth targets. Then a year later, in 2017, the government's projection of 3.2% growth for 2019-20 was first revised downwards to 2.4% from 3.2%. Then it was further reduced to 2.1% in 2018. Then it was reduced for the third time to 1.5% at the beginning of 2019.
That's not moving in the right direction.
That is clearly not moving in the right direction. That is going down instead of up. Later in 2019, the Planning Institute of Jamaica, the PIOJ, lowered its forecast for the 2019-20 economic growth for the fourth time from 1.5 to 0.7%, less than 1% now. And then the minister's fiscal policy paper tabled in this House in February lowered the 2019-20 growth projection for a fifth time to 0.6%. This came after Jamaica only saw a meager 0.1% growth in the December quarter of 2019, after 3 successive quarters of declining rates of growth. So, Mr. Speaker, the reality is that far from the strong growth that was promised in the name of prosperity, this government has failed to deliver. Its pattern has been to set modest official targets and then has failed to achieve even those modest targets. In the world of public relations and optics, they call this prosperity. In the real world, it is called samphire prosperity. Put another way, Mr. Speaker, growth is not moving in the right direction. And what's more, the fiscal policy paper tabled with this budget shows that prosperity is not even on the horizon. The growth projection for the coming fiscal year, 2021, is a mere 1.2%. And that, of course, is before the current crisis reached us. When we consider how poorly the government has performed against their projections over the last 4 years, we have to question whether we can realistically expect even this low rate of growth to be achieved, especially after the minister admitted that this budget was constructed without taking into account the impact of the worldwide coronavirus crisis and its possible impact on Jamaica's economy. Mr. Speaker, looking further ahead, the government has also disclosed that it is predicting an average annual growth rate over the coming 4 years of a mere 1.9%, less than 2%. No amount of marketing and spin can disguise the fact that 5 in 4 is now projected to be 1.9 in 8. So under this government, less than 2 in 8. So under this government, 5 in 4 is but a fleeting illusion to be pursued but never attained. Mr. Speaker, this government likes to talk about prosperity and building a new Jamaica without the evidence to support it. This is not their first, second, or third year in office. They have had 4 years to deliver on their promise. And what have we seen? Growth of 0.6% in the 4th year of their government. 1.9 in 8 years projected for the next 4 years on average. This is not prosperity. This is Samfi prosperity. Mr. Speaker, the government has spent the last 4 years talking about prosperity, but has failed to deliver it. The people of Jamaica want to actually feel it, not just hear about it. In the recent debate on the second supplementary estimates in February, the Honourable Minister of Finance struggled to find excuses for the low growth outturn of a paltry 0.6% for this fiscal year now ending. He said if you back out mining, growth would be stronger. He said if you strip out Petrojam, growth in manufacturing would be better. But Minister, the Jamaican people aren't interested in such excuses. They don't buy into playing with numbers by backing out this and stripping out that.
That's right.
What all Jamaicans want is a government that will back out prosperity.
That's right.
We want the government to back out the spiraling murder rate.
That's right.
And Jamaicans are demanding a government that will strip out corruption in public affairs. Furthermore, Mr. Speaker, as I've already mentioned, the budget for the coming fiscal year does not take into account the impact of the global coronavirus crisis. The minister announced on Tuesday that $2 billion will be provided for health-related expenditure as an advance on the Ministry of Health's budget, and a contingency amount of some $7 billion will be allocated to pay for unspecified COVID-19 impact mitigating measures, should the need arise. There will have to be supplementary estimates to authorize these appropriations in the coming financial year. But, Mr. Speaker, as we all know now, there is cause for very serious concern because our country is very exposed.
Yes.
Our tourism industry is vulnerable to vacationers' reluctance to risk international travel, with heightened concern about the worldwide growth of COVID-19 infection. Indeed, as we have already seen, cruise ship passenger traffic has been seriously disrupted. This is already impacting craft vendors, transportation providers, duty-free shop merchants, operators of attractions, and so on, all of who rely on these visitors. And we've seen more recently, we are hearing that the bookings and the cancellations, I should say the cancellations of bookings, are starting to mount up for the coming months. Our bauxite and alumina industry, Mr. Speaker, already hammered by the closure of Gisco Alpat refinery, is facing the prospect of a decline in demand from the dislocation in China and the wider world economy. Our manufacturers are exposed to serious disruption in the international supply chain. They face also much higher prices for alternative sources of their inputs. Substitutes are being researched by companies now, but I am told prices of replacements are up to 40% higher than what they're accustomed to. Serious delays in production in China mean that inventory of many consumer items and even pharmaceuticals will run low or run out altogether. Companies may have stockouts. Consumers may face substantially increased prices, which they'll have to bear with the same wages. We're already seeing a sharp reduction in logistics activity at the Port of Kingston, with port workers being told to take a pay cut or face layoffs. The port worker may be forced to take the pay cut, but his cost of living is going up. And Mr. Speaker, global financial markets are in turmoil. In Jamaica, we have seen our stock market shedding billions in market capitalization over the last 2 weeks. We are very exposed. And Mr. Speaker, I would just say on this matter that I think it's critical that the Bank of Jamaica be prepared to support the overall system if the need arises, in a situation in which it can be expected that trade creditors of businesses are going to be slower to pay. Businesses will face some liquidity challenges, and that will flow through the entire system. and we must be able to rely on the central bank to be proactive and aggressive in supporting the wider economy, so we don't overlay a health crisis and a wider form of crisis. So in addition to the public health risks facing the country, Mr. Speaker, the situation is also ominous from the standpoint of the economic impact of this major global shock. With the crisis looming, it cannot be business as usual. We've already seen the impact this coronavirus is having across the world, in China, Japan, South Korea, Iran, Italy, and now our closest major trading partner, the USA. Measures must be rigorously enforced to minimize the spread of the virus. In fact, we were shocked to hear on Tuesday that a man who was being held in quarantine because of possible coronavirus exposure could just drive off in a car and re-enter the community. That was not what we expected to hear at a time like this. My own view of this matter, Mr. Speaker, is that the government must get ahead of the curve. It is much better that we err on the side of strong measures early, rather than being reactive to the delayed effects of virus spreading later on. All the data shows that if we can minimize the spread of the virus as much as possible when it is just starting to take hold, it will inure to the benefit of our people, our economy, the health system, and so on. So I would urge the government not to be reluctant or shy of taking strong measures to reduce social distancing, or rather to improve or increase or encourage social distancing and reduce social interaction in public spaces and so on as much as possible. This is a time when people are not seeing the numbers of persons who are being infected, because there's a period of time that lapses between exposure to the virus and any manifestation of symptoms, and that is a dangerous time when it can spread. If we can stop social interaction as much as possible now, I think that we will reap better dividends from that. So I would support any measures that the government may want to introduce in that regard. We heard today about schools being closed for 14 days. That's a good step, Prime Minister, and I would urge you to go further. Because I think now is the time to act. Because the longer we leave it, the worse the situation we get, and we may not see it until 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks, and so on. Mr. Speaker, global health experts anticipate a cascading volume of cases if the virus gets into the community. We need isolation facilities across the island. We need properly trained and equipped medical staff to operate them with adequate protective gear, and we need them quickly. We expect that budgetary provision will be made for increased trucking of water supplies to areas affected by disruptions to water supply. And Mr. Speaker, I have to say something about this. Over the past week, I have been twice approached by communities in my constituency who have been without water. And I had to reach out to the National Water Commission to take action because, as they say, how can they keep their environment clean, their homes clean, wash hands and so on, if there is no water? Mr. Prime Minister, this has to be a priority. The National Water Commission have to be mandated and empowered to ensure that water is supplied to all communities. I know that there's a tendency, non-revenue water reduction and so on, but this is not the time for taking that kind of approach. It would be far too expensive if we were to take that approach. Let us make sure that water continues to be supplied. Thank God we've been having some rain. This is a good sign, and may that continue. But water, Prime Minister, let us not allow communities to be out of water. It is futile to tell people that the key to prevention of transmission is to wash their hands frequently, if at the same time we're failing to ensure that water is available to communities in which they live. We expect each ministry, department, and agency of government to conduct an impact analysis on its own business. They must identify the critical operations and processes and what will be required for them to stay operational if there's a major disruption. Immediate planning is required to ensure that critical services continue to be available to the population. We expect the government to take the lead in guiding businesses, especially small businesses, how to do their own business impact analysis. They may be facing supply chain disruptions, human resource depletion, technology disruption, delayed or lost sales, and significant cash flow constraints. Mr. Speaker, the Development Bank of Jamaica, the Jamaica Business Development Corporation, and so on, must be quickly resourced to provide this kind of assistance to MSMEs in particular. If the technical resources are not sufficient in the public sector, they can partner with the private sector professionals to get that job done. Mr. Speaker, the point is we can't really predict. We're in a very uncertain time. We're in a time we have not seen anything like this before. So we must prepare. We have seen what is happening in other countries, and we can't afford to take any chances. A lack of adequate preparation to make the impact on Jamaica of this crisis better will, in fact, result in it being much worse than it otherwise needs to be. The opposition, as we've said before, and I say it again now, stands ready to join in a national response to this looming crisis. We expect the government to lead proactively and not wait for events to unfold. Mr. Speaker, even if we are fortunate enough to be spared serious economic effects from the global coronavirus crisis, as we all hope we will be spared, there were some worrying trends in the economy that emerged in 2019 before the emergence of the coronavirus crisis. These include the fall in business confidence, the dysfunctional foreign exchange market, the crisis of violent crime and murders, the failure to effectively tackle corruption, jobs without growth, the spike in poverty in 2017, and what I would describe as growing inequality and tax policy. I now propose to say something about each of these matters, as they have been holding the country back from progress, and they will continue to do so even after the coronavirus passes, unless they are tackled. The first of them relates to business confidence. Mr. Speaker, the Jamaica Chamber of Commerce Business and Consumer Confidence Indices reports have shown that business confidence has fallen for 3 consecutive quarters from April through December 2019. This prompted the executive director of the firm that prepared the report, Mr. Don Anderson, to say, and I quote, "We can now speak definitively about a decline in business confidence in Jamaica. The devaluation and fluctuation of the Jamaican dollar, alongside the untamed crime monster, remain the factors that have weakened business confidence and influenced its downward trend. These are statistics that public relations and hype cannot change." That's right. Don Anderson's report says that in the final quarter of 2019, all 7 variables used to measure business confidence decreased. Businesses' assessment of the current economic conditions fell by 21 points. Expectations as to the current economic conditions fell by 6 points. Expected change in the economy is down by 7 points. Expected change in the firm's finances, down by 9 points. Current return on investments, down by 23 points. Expected change in profitability, down by 7 points. And current investment and expansion interest, down by 7 points. Mr. Speaker, this is nothing to gloat about. Rather, it is a clear sign that something is wrong in our economic management and approach. It shows that the businesses that drive economic activity are forming a pessimistic view of the outlook of the Jamaican economy. This must serve as a wake-up call for the government to address some of the issues that the opposition has been speaking about for a long time. And let me remind you, Mr. Speaker, I know me says so, or Don Anderson says so. I move to the foreign exchange market. Foreign exchange, Mr. Speaker, is a vital national resource. And Jamaica's foreign exchange market is clearly dysfunctional. It should not be open to a few players in the financial sector who have been given the privileged status by law of operating the foreign exchange market to profiteer.
Members' time for speaking has expired. House Leader.
Mr. Speaker,
I move that the member's time be extended sufficient to enable him to complete his presentation.
Those in favor? Those against? Ayes have it. Mr. Goldie.
Thank you, sir.
Right on, Mark, right on.
Mr. Speaker, it should not be open to a few players in the financial sector who have been given the privileged status by law of operating the foreign exchange market to profiteer from their access to the nation's foreign exchange at the expense of the economy, at the expense of business confidence, at the expense of economic growth and the Jamaican people. Over the past 2 years, the official reports have been that normal flows have been purchased by these authorized dealers. But at the same time, Mr. Speaker, manufacturers and other importers have been repeatedly complaining that the banks are unable to sell them foreign exchange to pay their ordinary import bills. This is harming the credit rating of these businesses with their suppliers, and it is making business planning impossible. And I remind you, Mr. Speaker, everyone knows that prices go up when the dollar falls, but they never come back down again. The market has been repeatedly plagued by a series of wild swings in the exchange rate over the last 2 years, since Jamaica formally adopted a free float system. For example, the official selling rate of the US dollar moved from $142.23 on the 12th of November 2019 to $131.53 on the 19th of December 2019, a movement of over $10 in a month. Then it fell back again by over $10 to $142.58 on the 13th of February 2020, only to come back to $135.54 last Friday, 6th of March. Another movement of over $7, which some are saying is to align the exchange rate with the assumptions underlying this budget. But Mr. Chairman, Mr. Speaker, what is causing these wild swings? In my view, it was a serious mistake to restrict the central bank's ability to actively manage the foreign exchange market without first putting in place the legal measures and market infrastructure to ensure that the allocation of foreign exchange through the market system cannot be abused by the few players who operate the market. It has left producers, importers, exporters, workers, and other consumers exposed and unprotected. It is not good policy. Mr. Speaker, the prevailing view is that the financial sector has been increasingly allocating the nation's foreign currency reserves, or the flows that the country enjoys, to finance large transactions from which they earn investment banking fees. This has diverted the foreign exchange that the economy needs to drive business and growth. Observers have also noticed a trend where financial groups buy up and hoard large amounts of foreign exchange during each financial quarter, then sell it off towards the end of the quarter, boosting their foreign exchange trading profits. This has been contributing to the repeated bouts of shortage of supply to the real sector of the economy and the wild swings in the exchange rate. This may benefit the few, but what about the many, Mr. Speaker? Business confidence and economic growth have been suffering from reliance on piecemeal strategies that are being implemented on a reactive basis to these issues. The situation in the foreign exchange market indicates that urgent legislative attention is needed to ensure fair market conduct in the interests of the economy as a whole. The long overdue trading portal to bring transparency to daily foreign exchange transactions also needs to be introduced without further delay. We've heard some recent announcements on that, and we look forward to seeing the rollout. Mr. Speaker, the next PNP government will implement a comprehensive set of policies to ensure a transparent and fair foreign exchange market. This will bring greater predictability and stability to the market. It is how producers, importers, and small business operators can have the confidence to plan, invest, expand their business, and grow the economy. Mr. Speaker, in the securities market, There are a lot of rules to ensure fair market conduct in how, for example, shares are traded on Jamaica Stock Exchange. The foreign exchange market needs to have a similar approach so that some of the activity that we've seen is comes to an end. Mr. Speaker, I move to the issue of safety of our people. Another major factor undermining Jamaica's investment and growth prospects is the failure to manage the crime situation effectively. This administration has proven itself incapable of combating violent crime and keeping Jamaicans safe. The Prime Minister's campaign promise in 2016 was that Jamaicans would be able to sleep with their doors and windows open under a JLP administration. That is another promise that has gone up in smoke. Jamaica, Mr. Speaker, that's right. Mr. Speaker, Jamaica will recall that under the last PNP administration from 2012 through 2015, the annual average number of murders in Jamaica was reduced by over 23% to 1,128 per year. I'll repeat that. Mr. Speaker, under the last PNP administration from 2012 to 2015, the annual average number of murders in Jamaica was reduced by over 23%. And Mr. Speaker, this was achieved at a time when the rescue of the Jamaican economy was in its early stages and the country had much less available financial resources to spend than it does now. Under our administration, there was significant emphasis on effective social interventions to take a public health approach to the epidemic of violence in Jamaica. This was spearheaded by the Unite for Change program. Regrettably, that excellent program, Unite for Change, was cut short by this government soon after they came to office. It was an ill-advised decision for which the country and our people have paid dearly. Can't get the use scared, it's true. Since 2016, under the current JLP administration, the annual average number of murders in Jamaica has climbed by over 24% to over 1,405 murders per year. Mr. Speaker, the government has responded to this horrible spike in murders under its watch by implementing a series of states of emergency in several parts of the country. The use of states of emergency over a prolonged period as a policing strategy is, in my view, unconstitutional, and it has also proven to be ineffective. The opposition has not blocked it, as the government has come up with no other crime plan, and we have taken the view that we must let the government pursue their strategy. Not anymore. But despite about half of the country, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker,
Members.
Despite about half the country being under a state of emergency, murders in 2019 were higher than in 2018, and substantially higher than all of the years of the last PNP administration. This trend continues as year-to-date murders in 2020 are once again trending even higher than in 2019. Mr. Speaker, Jamaica lurches from one horrendous incident to the next. Women and children are frequent murder victims. Many innocent people are being killed, being at the wrong place at the wrong time, or being a family member of someone who mixed up. In early March, in a parish that first went under a state of emergency in 2018, yet another Montego Bay businessman was attacked and shot dead in the heart of the city, only a short distance away from a police station, while going about his lawful business. Mr. Speaker, too many of our people are traumatized. Jamaicans are afraid, and this government has shown that it does not have the answers. The country is not safe in their hands. Apart from the terrible personal toll that violent crime inflicts on its victims and their loved ones, the fact is that crime also has a very serious economic toll. It drives up the cost of doing business, as owners have to invest in security systems and services to protect themselves, their businesses, and their customers. It deters people from making investments when they are unwilling to take the risk because they know that it may be only a matter of time before they become a victim. Criminality is costing our economy dearly, Mr. Speaker. This government has been able to increase spending on national security, but the outcome of that spending has been a failure. The additional resources have not achieved positive results, certainly in relation to murders. In the private sector, such a negative return on investment would mean that the person with whom the buck stops would be held to account. If this was a private sector, Prime Minister Brogard would be held accountable for his government's horrible performance on security. Until we come to grips with the crime cancer, we will never see sustained and strong economic growth, and our Vision 2030 targets will not be achieved. We must address violent crime by a comprehensive range of strategic policies that focus on its root causes, while empowering law enforcement and the justice system to effectively deal with cases. To this holistic approach, the People's National Party is fully committed. Mr. Speaker, I move to corruption. The government's other Achilles heel. Mr. Speaker, when the Prime Minister pays lip service to the fight against corruption, it is a time when Jamaica's ranking for corruption internationally has deteriorated. The proof of the pudding is in the eating, and actions speak louder than words. Mr. Speaker, the major organized crime and anti-corruption agency, MOCA, was created by the last PNP government. It was created to fight against major organized crime and corruption in this country. Having implemented MOCA, we then began the process of giving the new agency full legislative recognition. Then the 2016 election came. Imagine that after 4 years, despite organized crime and corruption taking over the country, the regulations to make MOCA effective have only today been tabled in this House. This can only be described as a shame and disgrace. Last year, May, Mr. Speaker, 2019, the Minister of National Security told the country that the MOCA regulations will be tabled in a couple of weeks. 9 months later, and the regulations are only brought to Parliament today. Mr. Speaker, these delays show a lack of will, in my opinion, to tackle corruption in our country. Indeed, the failure to table the MOCA regulations was one of the factors that influenced Jamaica's slippage in Transparency International's 2019 Corruption Perception Index. We slipped as a country 4 places after 2019 to 74 out of 180 countries ranked. Mr. Speaker, MOCA has continued to be hampered over this period of time by the failure to put the proper regulations in place to guide its operations. It has exposed MOCA to legal risks. And in my view, the delays have shown that there is no seriousness, despite all the nice-sounding words about tackling corruption. Similarly, Mr. Speaker, the Integrity Commission was conceptualized and the legislation was developed and brought to Parliament by the last PNP government. The Integrity Commission was conceived by us as a single, streamlined and independent anti-corruption agency with full prosecutorial powers, power to prosecute corruption cases, Mr. Speaker. The legislation was eventually brought into effect over 2 years later after the change of government in February 2018, but the Integrity Commission has unfortunately got off to a bad start. The first chairman, another commissioner, and the acting director of corruption prosecutions have all resigned. The posts of director of investigations and director of corruption prosecutions are still not filled with permanent appointees. Not a single corruption prosecution has been brought by the new Integrity Commission over 2 years after it's been established in law. And not a single investigation that was commenced by the new Integrity Commission has resulted in a report to Parliament. These examples show that the government is either unwilling or unable to take serious action against the cancer of corruption in our country. That could not happen under our watch. Couldn't happen. Mr. Speaker, it is in this context of pervasive corruption that in 2019, for the first time, the powerful Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, has placed Jamaica on their grey list of countries that will be subjected to heightened surveillance for money laundering and the financing of terrorism. This is a new low for Jamaica. We are very concerned about this recent development, and we urge the government to step up its game and ensure that everything is done to get Jamaica off that grey list as quickly as possible. If we fail to act quickly, our economy could face possible adverse measures that would set the country back. Mr. Speaker, amidst all this darkness, I must mention one beacon of light. As chairman of the Public Accounts Committee, I must commend the Auditor General and her department. With limited resources, they have investigated and brought several comprehensive reports to Parliament that have exposed serious corruption in the government, including at Petrojam and the Caribbean Maritime University. 2 cabinet ministers and numerous public boards appointed by this government have all had to resign. Thank God we have at least one effective agency fighting against corruption. Mr. Speaker, I move to jobs without growth or prosperity. On the employment front, while we celebrate the data showing the fall of unemployment to 7.2% as at October 2019, continuing a trend which commenced under the last P administration, we are also acutely aware that the published data does not present a full picture of the situation on the ground. 741,500 Jamaicans, 741,500, remain outside the labor force, meaning that they are not working or are not looking for work. Some of them are students and retirees and so on, but about 350,000 of them are outside the labor force who should be gainfully employed. And what of those who the statistics count as employed? The International Labour Organization defines the employed as any person working for more than 1 hour during the week in which the survey was conducted.
1 hour.
Any person working for more than 1 hour during the week in which the survey was conducted. This includes street vendors and even windshield washers, I'm told. Mr. Speaker, persons employed informally, and informal is defined as persons earning income but whose main job lacks basic social or legal protection or benefits such as NIS or housing trusts, numbered 484,800.
Say that again.
484,800 are employed informally. That's 40% of the employed labor force as of October 2018. It is not known how many of the recently created jobs are of an informal nature. The low unemployment numbers sound good, but we have to be conscious that the full picture isn't told by them. Every MP in this House can speak to the youth on the corner asking for help to find a work. Every MP. This continues to be the reality out there. Mr. Speaker, I move to the issue of poverty. The country was alarmed to learn that poverty increased in 2017 to 19.3% of the population, up from 17.1% in 2016. Corporate area, urban poverty increased by a frightening 30% in 2017. Mr. Speaker, this reversed a trend that had been going on from 2013 through 2016, when poverty had declined for 3 successive years. We brought poverty down for 3 successive years, despite the tough measures that we were implementing to rescue the economy.
That's right.
The poverty rate fell from 24.6% in 2013 to 21.2% in 2015, and to further to 17.1% in 2016. So we were very alarmed to learn that that trend had ended, and in 2017 it had spiked back up to 19.3% and 30% in the corporate area urban situation. Mr. Speaker, the 2017 figures showed poverty moving in the wrong direction, moving away from the 9.9% that was recorded in 2007 as one of the significant achievements of the then PNP government. 9.9% poverty. That's where we left it in 2007. Mr. Speaker, during the 18 years of that PNP administration, we brought poverty down to 9.9%, from 33.9%, which is where it was at the beginning of the 1990s. From 33.9% down to 9.9%. That's what we did for poor people in this country. Mr. Speaker, we await more current poverty data to see what has happened in relation to the poverty rate from 2019 onwards. Sorry, from 2018 onwards. The latest data we have is the 2017 data. I move now to the issue of inequality and tax policy. Mr. Speaker, inequality and poverty are long-standing and persistent issues in Jamaica. In terms of inequality, Jamaica ranks 96th out of 157 countries on Oxfam's Commitment to Reducing Inequality Index 2018. Jamaica lies between Honduras at 95 and Central African Republic at 97. Of the 25 countries in the Latin American and Caribbean region, Jamaica ranked 21st out of 25, 4th from the bottom of the pile in terms of inequality. In April 2017, the Planning Institute of Jamaica issued a report on the likely impact of the government's shift to greater indirect taxation. That report indicated that poverty would be worsened by the government's tax policy of removing $30 billion in 2 years of direct taxation from the incomes of persons earning over $600,000 per annum, and replacing it with various forms of indirect taxation totaling over $30 billion, borne by the general population of Jamaica, including the poor. While indirect taxation has advantages in terms of ease of collectability, indirect taxation is also regressive. It disproportionately burdens lower-income Jamaicans relative to the more well-off. For each dollar of their spending, they pay more tax as a result, each dollar of their income. It worsens inequality. Even in the early stages of the economic reform program that we had to pursue, we had reduced GCT from 17.5% to 16.5% to help soothe the bitter medicine. So when the opportunity came last year to give a $14 billion tax break, when the IMF allowed the primary surplus to be reduced to 6.5%, we had called for a further reduction in the rate of GCT. We called for that. And that didn't happen. We called for it, but it didn't happen because the government didn't think that the average Jamaican who had shouldered the burden of higher indirect taxation was deserving of a tax break. But, Mr. Speaker, we did not let up. Dr. Peter Phillips has consistently and stridently advocated for a 2% reduction in GCT. We are happy that at last the government has come on board, albeit with less than we were calling for. This 1.5 belongs to Dr. Peter Phillips. He called for it, he stuck with it, and he has won it for the Jamaican people. I say, big up Dr. Phillips, big up. And thank you for this 1.5. Mr. Speaker,
I'm going to ask for some more things.
Mr. Speaker, I am confident that this reduction in GCT's rate Mr. Speaker, I am confident that this reduction in the rate of GCT, this modest reduction, will end up paying for itself by encouraging greater compliance and increased spending, which generates more revenue. That is what happened with when the GCT threshold was increased. Again, something that we had called for, and that was implemented last year. The idea of increasing the threshold of annual sales of GCT registration emanated from Peter Bunting's 2018 sectoral debate presentation. And Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to see that the government has effectively adopted another recommendation from Peter Bunting's 2018 sectoral debate presentation. The 375,000 tax credit for companies with annual sales of less than or equal to $500 million is essentially the same as his recommendation not to disadvantage small businesses which are established in corporate form as companies versus sole proprietorships as individual traders. His point was equalize that for small businesses so it doesn't matter whether they trade as individuals or they trade through companies. The tax credit for small companies announced in this budget on Tuesday is equal to exempting 25% income tax on net taxable income of $1.5 million, which is what applies to individual traders. The first $1.5 million of individuals' income is exempt from tax. Therefore, the small company is being placed on the same economic tax footing, the same income tax footing, I should say, as the individual trader, as regards the first 1.5 million of net taxable income being shielded from tax. I should say, take a bow, Mr. Bunting. However, Minister, there is one glitch in this equivalence. Whereas before this, the small company was disadvantaged vis-a-vis the individual trader in that regard, and that has been fixed by this tax credit. Now the individual trader is disadvantaged against the small company because the individual trader's income tax rate jumps from 25% to 30% on net taxable income of over $6 million, whereas the small company's rate remains at 25% regardless of this amount of net taxable income. Mr. Speaker, the principle of equivalence between forms of organization for small businesses would suggest that this discrepancy in treatment should be revisited, and I would commend it to the Minister for his consideration. Minister, in the spirit of constructive engagement, there is another matter I wish to mention for your consideration. Importers of goods pay two amounts of GCT at the port. The standard rate, which is currently 16.5% and will become 15% as of the 1st of April, and an additional 5% of what's called advanced GCT, meaning that the total rate that they pay at the wharf is 21.5%. I've been receiving complaints, Minister, that with many businesses making margins of less than 30% on those goods, those businesses are perpetually in a credit GCT position where they are owed substantial amounts of GCT by the government on an ongoing basis. I was even told that often when they seek a refund of the credit balance owing to them, it triggers a tax audit of their business, and even, you could say, encourages corruption because arrangements are sometimes offered to businesses for refunds to be paid on a commission basis. Mr. Speaker, the additional 5% of advanced GCT on imported goods was introduced at a time when interest rates in the economy and therefore the cost of capital was higher than they are today, and resulting in higher markups to achieve the desired return on capital. With the economic reform program resulting in lower interest rates over the past 6 years and a lower required return on capital, markups are also lower. And there is an additional factor that has reduced markups. With people being able to import directly through buying online, with a range of delivery services available to import and bring goods to your door here in Jamaica, competition is greater, and that has further narrowed markups. Mr. Speaker, a business needs an average 30% markup on goods to be able to recover the 5% advance GCT paid at the port. For many businesses, 30% is now significantly higher than their average markup, leaving those businesses perpetually in a credit GCT position, where they are owed GCT by the government on an ongoing basis. And this hits their cash flow hard. It retards their ability to expand and drive economic growth. I'm therefore suggesting, Minister, that you look at this matter and consider reducing the rate of advanced GCT payable at the wharf, perhaps from 5% to 2.5%, in keeping with where margins have reached in the economy. Mr. Speaker, we support the announced GCT reduction of the standard rate to 15% from 16.5%. But we think the government should have gone further for the people.
That's right.
Further for the people. What we see is the government giving away $3 billion to the owners of the financial sector by cutting the asset tax in half. That $3 billion tax break will flow right to the bottom line of the owners of financial institutions who are already making very healthy profits. But I have to ask the question, Mr. Speaker, what about the ordinary customers of the banks who have been enduring high levels of fees and charges with no protection from this government? Mr. Speaker, Fitz-Jackson brought legislation to this House to protect bank customers from excessive fees and charges, but the government adamantly blocked it. The government has left the country's savers exposed. You've left the country's savers exposed. And now you're giving the banks a $3 billion tax break without even ensuring that something is done to protect savers from excessive fees and charges that numb out the money in their bank accounts. Mr. Speaker, I don't mind reducing the asset tax as part of the effort to improve the flow of credit in the economy. I don't mind it. I am in favor of trying to improve the flow of credit in the economy. But, in fact, we were committed to doing that as the fiscal situation improved. But we would have ensured that it was accompanied by measures to protect the vulnerable savers who can't afford to see their money being ravaged by excessive fees and charges. And Mr. Speaker, this reminds me that last year, when the government chose to give a big tax break in the last budget to real estate developers, at that time, I questioned the fairness of giving so much of the tax giveaway, that $14 billion, giving so much of it to sellers of real estate, when ordinary Jamaicans were bearing over $30 billion that was added to indirect taxes in 2016 and 2017. This plea fell on deaf ears and we were ignored. So far, that tax break has benefited the sales of units in projects which had already begun before the tax break was even given. And it has therefore ended up as a big windfall for property developers of projects that had already started before that tax incentive was given. We continue to question the fairness and effectiveness of the overall tax policy of the government. The fact is that other than mining, construction has been the worst performing sector in this fiscal year that we're in now, with negative growth in the construction sector, minus 0.6%, even after the big tax break for real estate developers. We would like to see much more done to ease the burden of the cost of living on ordinary Jamaicans, especially the elderly, single mothers, low-wage earners, and unemployed. Mr. Speaker, the government must use the hard-won fiscal space to increase their disposable incomes, stimulate spending, and drive economic growth. Mr. Speaker, the government's approach will only worsen the division of Jamaican society into the haves and have-nots. It is relatively few who are reaping profits from investments in the stock market and real estate, and who are seen enjoying life at the restaurants and entertainment spots uptown. On the other hand, the working poor, the pensioners and unemployed are increasingly left behind by a model of development that marginalizes the majority. Mr. Speaker, there is nothing in the government's approach to economic management that recognizes this inequality as a serious problem. It is tacitly accepted as a status quo, papered over by slick public relations in the era of fake news and misinformation. That is why many Jamaicans feel a sort of thing set, and that the system has nothing for them. Under this approach to national development, the haunting refrain of Bob Marley, "We no have no friend in a high society," still echoes northwards from Crossroads. All we see, Mr. Speaker, is public relations around the Prime Minister, exalting his brogad persona, showing off his new green Clarks. But Mr. Prime Minister, Santa never bring no Clarks for the ordinary people of Jamaica. It's you alone get. Most Jamaicans who have to buy new shoes have to go buy imitation downtown. Mr. Speaker, I have spent some time on these issues, these 7 issues, because I believe that they are important symptoms that tell why the Jamaican people are not reaping the fruits of years of sacrifice. The government has benefited from tremendous growth. This government has benefited from tremendous growth in public resources flowing from those sacrifices. Yet the outcomes of their policies are disappointing in so many critical areas and fail to meet the legitimate expectations of our people. And no amount of hype can alter the truth of that. In our view, Mr. Speaker, these outcomes flow from an approach to governance and policy which fails to address Jamaica's burning challenges. In our view, these outcomes flow from an approach to governance and policy which fails to address Jamaica's burning challenges. But before I get into how we would approach those challenges, it is important to recognize how we arrived at a place where more policy options have become open to the country. The era of prudent fiscal management to bring down the public debt to sustainable levels began with us. We were the ones who did the heavy lifting of implementing the major structural reforms that have led to the success of 6.5 years of IMF programs. Mr. Speaker, in fiscal terms, that success is real. In 2015-16, the government of Jamaica collected $411.85 billion in taxes, $411.85 billion in 2015-16. The current projections for 2021, 2020 to 2020, the coming fiscal year, see the government of Jamaica collecting $603.8 billion in taxes.
And give him back how much?
The Jamaican population is now bearing $192 billion more in annual taxes than 5 years ago. The increase in tax collection since 2015-16 is 46.6%. This far outstrips the increase in inflation of 23.8% over that period. So tax collections have increased in real terms very substantially over the last 45 years. Mr. Speaker, we know that all this tax money didn't come from growth, as there's been precious little growth. It is generally recognized that the major factor in this quite dramatic increase has been the far more efficient tax collection as a result of the various reforms to the system of tax administration, reforms that were implemented largely under the last PNP administration. That is the bedrock of the fiscal health that Jamaica is enjoying today. These reforms have all delivered beyond expectations and created the fiscal space that this government has inherited from the heavy lifting of the last PNP government. There is much more money available now because of the work we did and the fiscal foundation we laid. This government has been reaping the fruits of the efforts and good work of those who came before. And this is a matter of record, and credit should be given where it is due. I would also like to speak to the record of growth, Mr. Speaker, over the past 15 years. In its full 6 years of government over that 15-year period, the PNP achieved real GDP growth of 6% in these 6 years. Despite all the hype, in the 7 full years of the JLP in that 15-year period, the JLP has brought cumulative negative real GDP growth of 0.5% in its 7 years. In terms of achieving an acceptable minimum level of real GDP growth, in terms of achieving what we would regard as an acceptable minimum level of real GDP growth, in the last 30 years, the benchmark of 3% was set by the PNP administration of 2006-2007 fiscal year. History records that the only year in which Jamaica has achieved 3% growth during this period was under the People's National Party, and that was under the leadership of the Most Honourable Portia Simpson Miller. Mr. Speaker, on Tuesday, the Minister made much of comparing the average growth rate in the last 4 years, 1.2%, with the 4 years before that, 0.4%, a difference of 0.8, less than 1%. What he failed to mention was that our government, in the first 4 years of that 8-year period, was delivering positive growth after inheriting a debt-to-GDP ratio of 147% and a poverty rate of over 20%, and having to achieve a primary surplus target of 7.5% to bring this country back from the brink where they left it. We left office with the debt-to-GDP ratio down at 150% after the new accounting adjustments were factored in. Poverty substantially lower and trending downwards, and Jamaica earned from the IMF a lower primary surplus target of 6.5%. What the minister also failed to mention was that the JLP government of 2007 to 2011, under Bruce Golding and latterly Andrew Holness, had averaged negative growth of 1%, minus 1% in their 4 years in office. They had averaged negative growth of 1%. That's minus 1%. The public debt climbed from 107% of GDP to 147% under their watch. Poverty rose from 9.9% to over 20% in their 4 years. And the IMF program was abandoned because they could not even sit the test. That is a mess that they left for us to clean up, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, thank God that the government of the Most Honourable Portia Simpson Miller, along with Dr. Peter Phillips' steady hand as finance minister at the time, led Jamaica out of that wilderness that the JLP had brought it into and onto the path of sound economic management, which has led Jamaica to where we are today. Mr. Speaker, I want to talk a little bit about divestment of state assets to the public. We support Mr. Speaker. Yes, it's about them. It's about them. Reality. Sometimes reality hot. Sometimes it's hot. Yeah. When you throw the stone at the end of the pen, you know how it lick. Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we support the privatization. House leader. Easy yourself. Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I move to the divestment of state assets to the public. We support the privatization of commercial state assets through the stock market. People should be reminded that this is not a new approach for Jamaica. In the 1990s, the People's National Party led the way with the sale to the public through the stock market of the government shares in Radio Jamaica, RJR, Caribbean Cement Company, Carib Steel, and others. Mr. Speaker, before a government can sell shares to the public, there has to be a business that makes those shares an asset. The PNP was instrumental in the creation of the assets which the government is now selling to the public. It was a government of the Most Honorable P.J. Patterson that had the vision to create and implement the Highway 2000 East-West project, which has given rise to the highway from Kingston into Clarendon and hopefully to Manchester soon, owned by Trans-Jamaican Highway. We built that highway. People should recall, Mr. Speaker, that at that time, the JLP opposed that very project, opposed it. And now they would like to claim it. Now they want to claim it as their own. Sam 5 business. Mr. Speaker, we created that asset that Trans-Jamaican Highway has become. The People's National Party and the P.J. Patterson, we call it Highway 2000. It was one of the Millennium Projects. And it is that you have been able to sell to the public now. We're very happy for the public to be able to enjoy something that we created. And Mr. Speaker, similarly, Mr. Speaker, it was the PNP government that had the vision to create and implement the wind-generated renewable energy company known as Wigton Wind Farms that was sold to the public last year. We built Wigton, we conceptualized Wigton, and we brought it to where it was so that it could be sold to the public. Mr. Speaker, if it was not for those solid achievements of the past PNP administrations in creating those opportunities, there would be no shares to sell to the public in those two recent successful IPOs. Nor would the government be in a position, as it is now, to offer the remaining JPSCO shares for divestment via an IPO. We had the vision to sell, to bring strong shareholders into JPS at a time when it was needed and kept 20% for the government and people of Jamaica, which you now plan to sell to the public. Mr. Speaker, on Tuesday, the minister made much of the bottom-up allocation formula being used in the government's recent IPOs. The bottom-up formula where smaller applicants get filled first. Mr. Speaker, that is not new. It has been the standard approach for government divestments of shares through public offerings over the years, where broadening public participation has always been an objective. Indeed, in some instances like RGR, we went even further by limiting the maximum that any single shareholder could own to ensure that the broadly held ownership would continue into the future. The minister also made much of the fact that public sector workers were given priority in these offerings. Mr. Speaker, we have always promoted worker participation in the ownership of the economy, including as part and parcel of the divestment strategy. We introduced the employee share ownership plan in the 1990s, and many workers have benefited tremendously through participation in employee share ownership plans. Some of them have become millionaires out of it. We divested the government printery just on this road to all its employees, 100% employee owned. And that business, now known as Jamaican Printing Services, remains 100% employee owned over 2 decades later and still serves as a printer of official documents for the government of Jamaica. I move to our plan for the future. Mr. Speaker, we are committed. We are committed to maintaining fiscal prudence, and continued public debt reduction to the point of debt sustainability. I want to repeat that because it's very important. We are committed to maintaining fiscal prudence and continued public debt reduction to the point of debt sustainability. Investors, business people, and ordinary Jamaicans alike can rest assured that we are committed to ensuring that Jamaica achieves its goal of a 60% debt to GDP ratio, which, as I've said before, remains the international standard of fiscal sustainability for developing countries. We are proud that it was under our watch that the Jamaican economy was finally turned around so that generations to come will benefit from the sacrifices made by the Jamaican people of this generation. Mr. Speaker, Dr. Peter Phillips, as the then Minister of Finance, deserves credit for negotiating that turnaround. Dr. Phillips, your astute statesmanship allowed Jamaica to navigate those choppy waters. It was a time when many stakeholders... Mr. Speaker, can you protect me from...
Order, please. Order, don't disturb the speaker. The member is addressing the floor.
Krista will answer her.
Members, please. The member is addressing the floor. Both sides. Minister.
Dr. Peter Phillips, as the then Minister of Finance, you deserve credit for negotiating the turnaround in Jamaica's performance and prospects. Your astute statesmanship allowed Jamaica to navigate those choppy waters. It was a time when many stakeholders were called on to give up something for the national good. And you expertly managed that process and got them all on board for Jamaica. Those were very challenging times, and you rose to the challenge for the lasting benefit of our country. Fortunately, Mr. Speaker, Jamaica's situation in 2020 is not the same as the darkness that we inherited in 2013. It is now time for us to change gear and focus on our real problems.
That's right.
Now is a time we can do much more for the people. The government has substantially increased capital expenditure. There is provision for over $153 billion of public sector capital expenditure in this budget, $153 billion. Yet, despite maintaining public sector capital expenditure at over 6% of GDP, economic growth has been lacking. Their model is not working, and something needs to be done. Mr. Speaker, we believe that the time has come to vastly increase the nation's investment in the social transformation of the Jamaican people. It is only profound social transformation that will lead to the sustainable and inclusive economic growth that Jamaica yearns for. The People's National Party has always rejected the trickle-down approach to national development. As fiscal space opens, more can and must be done to address the fundamental problems that plague our society. This government has no commitment or strategy for doing that. If we stay on the current path of lopsided, inequitable development, the negative trends that bring hopelessness and despair to our people are only going to continue and get worse. Mr. Speaker, we have to use the stronger financial position of the state so that a wider cross-section of Jamaica enjoys increased opportunities for prosperity and an improved quality of life. Last year, the minister denied that he was practicing trickle-down economics, but was instead promoting an economy where things would bubble up. Bubble up. Mr. Speaker, the collapsing growth figures since then show that the bubble pop, growth drop. Oh my God, what a flop! What a flop! The collapsing growth figures since his bubble up statement show that the bubble pop, growth drop. Oh my goodness, oh my. what a flop. It is not growth that has bubbled up, Minister. It is not growth that has bubbled up. The growth bubble burst, it popped. But murder bubble up, corruption bubble up, dengue bubble up, garbage bubble up, hardship and sufferation bubble up. Mr. Speaker, Jamaica needs a different philosophy to guide policy. It must be based on the principled pursuit of social justice and equality of opportunity. We are committed to leading the fundamental social and economic transformation that is needed to build a stable, caring society in which all Jamaicans are treated as equal citizens and on which sustainable growth and development can become a reality. It is the only way forward to achieve the motto of the Vision 2030, Jamaica, the place of choice to live, work, raise families, and do business. The government crows about houses being started, but the dilapidated housing conditions and failing infrastructure in low-income neighborhoods are largely ignored. The announcement of $500 million for Hope Housing isn't moving the needle. A few Hope houses here and there hardly scratches the surface of this problem. Mr. Speaker, people live in the squalor of infrequent garbage collection. They dump their garbage in the gullies or in open lots because they have nowhere else. Rubbish piles up amid swarms of flies and rats. Stinking sewage water runs down the roads from old block pipes no longer fit for purpose. Their street lights are the last to be fixed, as darkness harbors gunmen, thieves, and rapists. Their local high schools are underperforming, with an intake averaging between 32% and 55% in the entrance examinations, and 8 out of 10 students leaving with less than 5 C-Sec subjects. In rural areas, the chronic crisis ailing the sugar industry has left rural economies devastated. Criminality rushed into that void as productive activity disappeared. Jamaica is shocked to see the level of murders in deep rural areas, once peaceful and safe communities. Rural families struggle with high transportation costs to send their children to school. The lack of a modern and comprehensive rural development policy means that these problems persist with no solutions forthcoming from this government. Mr. Speaker, it is these conditions and the profound negative social effects resulting from them that must be turned around for Jamaica to achieve a cohesive, balanced, and safe society. There is nothing in the policy of this government to make a real change to these conditions over the next few years. This is where the available public resources must be targeted. This is the mission of the next PNP government. We believe education and training are the future, and they will be a central plank of our commitment to social transformation. This government hasn't even had a proper Minister of Education for a year, since the former minister had to go as the CMU scandal came to light. Mr. Speaker, under this government, basic schools are struggling to survive, and many have been closing under the weight of high operating costs. I can tell you I've seen it myself. Social transformation, Mr. Speaker, means prioritizing investment in early childhood development to start our children right. We know they are bright, and the nation will reap rich dividends from investing in them. We need to fill the gaps from teenage pregnancy, single-parent families, and poverty. The state must ensure adequate nutrition, infrastructure, and technical support for basic schools to ensure a first-class start in life as a foundation of all Jamaican children. Basic school teachers must be paid in keeping with the critical role they play in national development. The weaker primary schools are channeling underprepared students into the weaker non-traditional high schools, perpetuating the weak social fabric of the country and the high level of violent crime. Social transformation means prioritizing investment in these primary schools. They must receive more attention. We have too many children coming into high school who cannot read and write. The system must spot them early and address their needs. Our non-traditional high schools lag far behind the far smaller number of traditional high schools in terms of graduating students with a minimum of 5 CSEC subjects, including English and maths. This situation, which we have referred to as the apartheid in Jamaica's school system, must be addressed to tackle the growing inequality and social dysfunction in our society. Minister, while we welcome the adjustment of the commencement date for the repayment of Student Loan Bureau loans to 14 months after graduation, this does not go anywhere near far enough. The present structure of the Student Loan Bureau loans is to place the risk of finding employment after graduation and at a salary that can manage the monthly student loan payments entirely on the student. It is the student who bears that risk. This acts as a strong disincentive for students even applying for student loans, especially from less well-off families. It is not right that graduates who can't find a job after struggling hard to earn their degrees find their names being published in the newspaper as loan delinquents. The need to find guarantors is also discriminatory against poor students. The need to find guarantors is also discriminatory against poor students. And the numbers show that recovery from guarantors of delinquent loans is relatively insignificant in any event. Mr. Speaker, I'm going to repeat that point. The need to find guarantors, I struggle to deal with you. The need to find guarantors is also discriminatory against poorer students. And the numbers show that recovery from those guarantors of delinquent loans is relatively insignificant in any event. We think that this is the wrong approach, Mr. Speaker. We believe that it is the state, not the nation's students, who must bear the responsibility of creating economic conditions where the students can readily find good-paying jobs. We think that the monthly payments on student loans should be capped at a manageable percentage of the borrower's actual income. I repeat that. The monthly payments on student loans should be capped at a manageable percentage of the borrower's actual income. The next PNP government will reconfigure the Student Loan Bureau loan structure to cap monthly payments at a manageable percentage of actual income, so it is not an excessive burden on young graduates. We will make borrowing a student loan to invest in their education some things that students no longer need to fear. We will also eliminate the requirement of guarantors as a condition of students being able to borrow student loans, so that families don't have to find guarantors anymore, and every student can have access to funding to further their education. Mr. Speaker, greater and more effective investment in education and training, supported by research and development in science and technology, are essential if Jamaica is to rise and achieve sustainable and inclusive national development. Many of the jobs being created now are low-skill jobs, paying low-skill wages. Jamaica has made strides under successive administrations as a business process outsourcing destination, but our competitive advantage must be less about providing a low-cost opportunity for outsourcing, and we must transition the sector over time into more knowledge process outsourcing services, leveraging the talent and training of young Jamaicans in legal, accounting, digital services, and so on. To achieve this, Mr. Speaker, we must modernize our educational and training institutions to produce the workforce of the 21st century global economy. Investment in teacher training institutions will be a priority, focusing on providing the expertise in teaching mathematics, science, foreign languages, and other strategic subject areas that national development into first world status depends on. We will invest in bringing technology to our schools to relieve parents of the unnecessary and cruel burden of buying so many expensive textbooks, some of which are hardly even used. Textbooks will be accessible to children online, and classes will be delivered by the best teachers through online channels. The Tablet in Schools program crashed under this government, with virtually nothing delivered after one delivered after 4 years. Shame and disgrace. The program to provide students with computers. The program to provide students with computers will be revamped and accelerated to ensure that all students can take full advantage of online delivery of the highest quality educational materials. Mr. Speaker, we will enhance HEART and other vocational training institutions to make their offerings relevant and effective in preparing youth for employment with greater value-added components. All impediments to youth taking advantage of these opportunities must be identified and tackled. Mr. Speaker, over and over I see training opportunities being provided and not taken up by young people in Jamaica. We need to understand what is going on, why they aren't accessing them, and we must address those issues so they can join the workforce at the right level. Where will the resources to do these things be found? The government is spending over 6% of GDP on capital expenditure. The key is how we choose to utilize these resources. We will prioritize allocating the available public resources to financing the social transformation of our people that is critical to securing our nation's future. In terms of housing, our focus is on social transformation, and that means priority attention must be given to thousands of families and elderly persons across Jamaica who are living in substandard housing conditions, thousands of families and elderly Jamaicans. We will empower home occupiers to improve their own homes, building proper bathroom facilities, toilet facilities, repairing leaking roofs and collapsing walls will be fixed, all supporting local tradesmen and stimulating the local economies in deprived communities. We will do that. We will focus on delivering property titles to thousands of Jamaicans who have long-standing tenure where they live. Long-standing tenure where they live, so that their expenditure on their homes is an investment in their own capital and their own family's wealth. We have a plan to solve the titling problem in this country. Mr. Speaker,
The cheerleaders are listening on both sides. So no go ahead and cheer one another. We're not in a parliament making a presentation. We're a group of cheerleaders.
All right. Mr. Speaker, innovative legislation will support these initiatives. In the same way as we pioneered the legislation to liberate thousands of multi-generational estates that were tied up for decades in a legal quagmire of colonial-era laws that held our people back from progress. We did that by revamping the Administrator General's Act. The only country in the world to have that approach. Mr. Speaker, one of the impediments to sustainable, real GDP growth in Jamaica is archaic bureaucratic processes, grounded in legislation, both primary and secondary legislation that is out of date and in need of modernization. Ability to identify and proactively push through reforms is therefore a key performance metric of any government in Jamaica. Key. Under the last PNP administration, we passed 121 acts of parliament during the 49 months that we were in office, averaging 2.47 acts per month in office. 32 of those 121 acts were transformational legislation required under the Jamaican IMF program and were critical to Jamaica's successful and internationally acclaimed performance under that program. Mr. Speaker, in contrast, this JLP government has passed 99 acts of parliament in its 48 months in office, averaging 2.06 acts per month. So, measured by laws passed, the PNP's legislative performance was over 20% better than the JLP government. Mr. Speaker, this is reflected in the inadequate response. This is reflected in the inadequate response to the epidemic of murders that is devastating Jamaica. The one significant attempt in their 4 years in office, which was the ZOSA legislation in mid-2018, has had very limited national impact. 2017 has had very little national impact, only being used in 2 small areas of the country, Mount Salem and Denham Town. When we were in office, we introduced DNA legislation. We passed anti-gang legislation. We passed the anti-lotto scam legislation. We established MOCA. Those were strategic laws that are bearing fruit now, not to mention all the reforms of the justice system, which the Chief Justice is now leveraging and using. Mr. Speaker, I already mentioned the MOCA regulations that have been preventing MOCA from optimal performance. Similarly, the failure to implement the new Road Traffic Act, passed in 2018, developed under our watch as well. We tabled it, but we didn't have time to pass it. The failure to implement the new Road Traffic Act is another case of waiting on unfinished regulations and is contributing to the chaos on the roads and the spike in road fatalities. We have seen road fatalities climbing in the last year. The same is true of the Disabilities Act, again passed, one of the proud pieces of legislation passed by our government to empower and liberate disabled people, something I am committed to because my father worked for them the entirety of his life, and I grew up around them. That was passed over 5 years ago to empower disabled people and uphold their human rights. It still lies fallow, not properly implemented. Mr. Speaker, while unemployment has continued to fall, the aggregate demand remains weak because much of the labor force is earning low wages, failing to drive growth and inflation to levels targeted by the government for much of the last 2 years. Jamaica's low-wage economy flows from underinvestment in the human capital of our people, falling productivity, and low-value-added jobs. We believe that it is only transformational investment in our people that will secure the future that our country has been striving for since independence. Our most valuable asset is our people.
That's right.
Investment in our people can't fail. It is the key to increasing our national productivity so that we can compete with the world other than on the basis of cheap labor.
That's right.
Mr. Speaker, a contributing factor is also the prevalence of the pernicious contract work system, which deprives many workers of basic benefits, itself facilitated by the state's own weak enforcement of hard-won rights that have been enshrined in our labor laws since the 1970s. Mr. Speaker, this must be addressed once and for all, so that the full suite of basic benefits are enjoyed by all Jamaican workers, regardless of the contractual mechanism used to hire them. We are committed to achieving that, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, our focus is on identifying the major impediments to our country's development and identifying real solutions to those problems. Some of those problems are deep, long-standing socio-cultural issues that must be tackled. The legacy of this government shows that to focus primarily on conventional approaches to stimulate growth and job creation will not achieve positive results, because the impediments to growth are deep socioeconomic imbalances that must be confronted and overcome. Poverty is there and prosperity will never trickle down. Right. We must invest in our people and lift them up. Happily, Mr. Speaker, the success of Jamaica's fiscal reform program over the last 6-7 years means that the macroeconomy can support greater focus and attention on solving these problems and building a bright future for our people. We see our people as the resource that can lead our country to greatness. Our emphasis will be on freeing our people of the many constraints that are holding them back. We will invest in Jamaicans to build the new Jamaica. Mr. Speaker, equality of opportunity is our motto. Social justice is our guide. We are the movement that led Jamaica out of colonialism. We are the movement that brought a social revolution in the 1970s to root out the historic discriminations of the past. We are the movement that liberalized the economy from excess regulation, abolished exchange controls, and created the market-driven system that encourages the entrepreneurial spirit and business acumen of our people. We are the movement that brought modern infrastructure investment in our seaports and airports, the highway linkages across our island, north, south, east and west, and a modern system of telecommunications. We are the movement that brought the Jamaican economy back from the brink of disaster, structurally reformed the economy, and put the country on a sustainable fiscal path towards low debt, and won the confidence of Jamaicans to live through bitter medicine so that our nation can look for a brighter future. We are the movement. We are the movement that will move Jamaica onto a path of just and sustainable development. We will tackle the causes of persistent poverty and social dysfunctionality. We will socially transform our society to one where Jamaicans can live in love for each other and our economy can grow and thrive. We will bring back the hope and we will bring back the love. God bless the Jamaican people. God bless our beloved nation. One love, one heart, one destiny. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The word is love.